Okay, in this video tutorial, I'll go through what we did in class with importing all the high noon elements and making adjustments to them and getting everything ready to start with our Previs. So first of all, I'm going to just set my project to where I've downloaded the files to. So just go to Set Project. I'm working in this folder here. Set and then File, Open. And the first one I'm going to open is the HM3 land. It doesn't really matter which order, I'm just doing it this way. So double click on that and this will load up. And this is a basic kind of polygon cylinder. Okay, that's just been modified to look like a landscape, a very simple landscape. So if I zoom in, you can see it looks like this. Okay, I'm viewing this with the 5 key so I can see the materials. So if I press the 4 key, that's wireframe, and 5 for materials. 6 would be with textures, but there's just a colored material on this object at the moment. The only thing I'm going to do with this, I'm going to add it to a display layer. So make sure you've got your channel box layer editor open on the right hand side. Look, it's this icon here to toggle it on and off. I'm in Maya Classic mode. If your Classic mode doesn't look the same as mine, you've changed things about and you want to reset it, you can go Windows, Workspaces, and reset Maya Classic to factory default. Okay, you can do this to any of the workspaces. You can reset them to the default. I'm going to pick that. I'm going to click on this icon here. This creates a new layer and adds that selected object to it. This icon just creates a new layer. You can then select the object and you can right click and you can add and remove objects to that layer. So you can have lots of objects assigned to one layer. Okay, so I'm going to double click on this. I'll just call it land, just so I know what this is. If there's any conflict of naming of nodes, so say this object was called land, which it isn't, it would just give it a number at the end here. We've got visibility to turn it on and off so we can see it. We're going to set it to R, which is reference. Look, this is template, so it's like a wireframe. Again, you can't pick it. We're going to set it to R so we can see it, but we can't select it. Next, we're going to import the next item. So we're going to go File and Import them. So we can import them over our land object and they're combined together into the scene. If we did a new scene or opened a scene, sorry, it would overwrite and we would lose the land. So let's import and we'll load in our background town. Double click on that. And look, there it is. If I drag a selection box around it, press F, there's the little low poly town. Okay, these are all just separate objects. Look, if I pick them, like so, you can see them. If I bring up my outliner window here, I can see what's in my scene. So look, I've got the land. And you'll notice with this, you can select things that are on display layers from the outliner, even if they're set to reference. So you can't select them in the viewport, but you can still pick them in here. And then these are all the cubes that make up the town. Okay, and then the other things, it's got the cameras and the default lights, so just ignore those. But it's good having the outliner open. I like the hypergraph, which is this view, this one here, but you kind of need a bit more screen space for this. Okay, but it displays similar things. It displays all the nodes and you can adjust this. It doesn't display the cameras. You can turn the cameras on if you want to view those, but look, it's got the nodes that exist in our scene. Okay, it's a similar view, but it needs a bit more screen space. So if you've got 2 monitors, it's lovely. What we're going to do with this is if we wanted to edit these as a big group, it would be tricky. We can pick them all, but if we scale them, they're all scale individually. You can see they've all got their own pivot points. And they're scaled individually. So what we can do, we can group these together. I'm not actually going to group them together. There's something called edit and group, and you can pick a collection of objects, and what it does, it parents them all to a node, and then you can just pick that node and you can scale everything through that node, as well as still adjust things individually. I'm going to create a locator just so the locator will be in the center of the objects and I can visually see this thing. Okay, so in create, I'm going to go locator. This little thing, if I press F, you can see I've got my scale node there. If I press W to go to my transform node, if I press F, this is the locator. If I press 4 to go into wireframe, you can see what it is. It's just a little like crosshair. Okay, I'm going to move this into the center of my village. Okay, my town. I'm going to use the little green square here. That means it's going to move it in the X and the Z, but not up down. It just moves it flat to the floor. I'm going to just put it roughly there. Okay. And then I'm just going to parent everything to this object. So to do this, I need to pick all the child objects, all the objects that are going to be below this in the hierarchy, and then I pick the parent object last. So I'm going to hold Control Shift down, which is add to selection. So I can just drag selection boxes around these. If you keep moving things around, press Q to hide the manipulator. So you're just in pure selection mode. And I just pick all of these. And if you ever make a selection you don't want, like say I picked this earlier on, so I did something like this, I can hold Control down on its own and deselect that. And then Control Shift adds to selection. Shift on its own toggle selection so that it inverses the selection like so. So get used to Control Shift, Control and Shift to select things. Last thing is the node. So I'm just going to hold down Control Shift and click on that. So that's the last thing I select. And then I'm just going to press the P key, P for parent. And look, you can see over here, we've got locator 1, then underneath that is all those cubes. So if I want to move this town about as a kind of collective, I can just pick that on its own. You can see the other things highlight, they're not actually selected. So keep an eye on your outliners to see what's selected. So I can pick that, I can rotate them, I can scale them, and I can move them about all together like this, okay? If I drag a selection box around them all, you can see they're all selected. So I can move them and stuff, but you can see they're doubling the movement. The locator's staying here and they're moving off because they're moving as well as the locator. So it's kind of multiplying the movement. Same with if I scale, they'll be scaling through the locator as well as scaling locally. So they do something weird, like they're scaling through each other again. And the same with rotate. You'll see they're all rotating on their own individual axes as well as through the locator. So just be aware of that. Get used to hierarchies. Just picking the locator will allow you to move these things. You watch the difference if I scale them now, that they keep their relative distance, because the only thing that's actually scaling is this. And these are scaling through it. They're not scaling locally. I hope that makes sense. I'm going to press the 5 key again, go back to this view. Once we've got the town, I'm not going to actually move it about. I'm going to leave it where it is for now. But I am going to put this on a display layer. I'm only going to pick the locator because anything below it in the hierarchy will be affected by the display layer. I'm going to click on this, double click on this. I'll just call it town and save that. And I'll set that to R as well. Okay, so we've got those two things in our scene. Next, I'm going to load up. I'll just collapse this down. I'm then going to import the sign. So import sign, that one there, import that, continue. And this will appear at the origin. This is where I saved it. So if you drag a selection box here, if you've got everything on display layers, the only thing you'll select is the thing that's selectable. Press F to frame it. There it is. And it's made up of 3 elements. Look, we can see that this here in the outliner. Okay, and what I want to do, I want to be able to just pick the post and move it, and the little signs go with it. So we're going to parent these things together. Now I've cleaned this up, so look, if I pick this, look, it's all nicely zeroed over here. Scale set to 1, this is set to 0, as is the post and the background sign as well. Whenever you parent things together, it's good practice in most circumstances to make sure all of these are reset to 0 and the scale set to 1. You can do this quickly by just selecting the objects in object mode and clicking on the poly modeling shell, this snowflake icon here. This is the freeze transform, and this will get rid of any transforms, any rotation, scaling, and set it all back to 0 and the scale back to 1. And I would also recommend deleting any construction history. We'll look at that a little bit more when we create the skydome. Okay, so click on that, and it just cleans the object up, and then we can parent these things together. So I want to parent the little signs to the post. So look, I pick the signs, hold Shift, Control Shift, sorry, and pick the post. So the child objects first, and the parent object, and then I press P. And look, we can see over here, look, there's the post, and there's the sign 1 and 2 underneath it. Going back to that hypergraph view, which I do prefer, but as I mentioned, it takes a little bit more screen space. We can see the same kind of configuration here in my scene. So we've got the land here, we've got that locator with the town and all the individual houses underneath it. We've got the sign post and then the individual signs underneath it. So now we can manipulate just the signpost and these will follow. The last thing I want to do, I don't like the pivot of the sign being here. So anytime you select an object and you move it, where the manipulator tool appears, so like if I press E, here's the rotate, scale and stuff, this is where the pivot of the object is. And it's best demonstrated by if you rotate or if you scale it, it will scale from that point. You can edit that pivot by either pressing the insert key, which takes you into full-on pivot mode. So if I press the insert key now, I've just changed to move mode. You can see this is the pivot, and I can move this down to the base of the object. And then press insert again, and it takes you out of that. You can also do it by holding down the D key. Okay, the D key works as well, which is good if you're using an Apple Mac, because I don't think Apple Mac keyboards have an insert key. Once I've moved that, it just means that I can move this about and scale it from that point, like a floor point. I did the same with the houses. I've got all their pivots, I think, at the floor of them. So if I did need to scale them, they scale from the floor and not through it. Okay. Lastly, I'm going to put this on a display layer. So I'm going to pick just the post, because like I said, the signs will also do the same as they're part of the hierarchy. Click on a new layer, double click on this, call it sign, and save it. Okay. And then I'll set that to R. Again, so I can't pick anything in my scene. And we can start to move these things about in a bit when we've got the camera in our scene. The last thing we're going to do is create a sky dome, just so we don't have grey in the background. This is purely for quick rendering, just for play blasting in this viewport. Okay. When we start, if we want to do nice renders using, say, the Arnold renderer, we use a different technique. But we just want to fill this in with a color, and using half a sphere is a good way of doing this. So I'm going to create a sphere from my poly modeling shelf, like this icon here. I'm then going to press the R key to scale it up. Now, when you first press the R key or any of the manipulator keys, if you see what's highlighted in yellow, it's the universal scale. So I can actually just press the mouse wheel now and drag that. And basically, the mouse wheel is quite good. You don't actually have to click on one of the axes of the manipulator. You can just highlight it. Look, I just click on it here, and then look, I can just press the mouse wheel and drag, and it just scales in the selected axis. And it's the same for the move tool. Look, if I just wanted to move it on the X, I can do that. I could just drag it around with the left mouse button, but sometimes it gets a bit fiddly. You can just move away. If you're trying to look at something with the cursor out the way, it's quite a nice way of doing things. So going back to scale, I highlight that, and I'm going to scale this up, and I'm going to scale this up until it envelops the land. So look, maybe go into wireframe mode, so press 4, keep scaling up, and look, I've scaled it up to 446. Let's type in 500. Okay, so I'm going to hold shift down and click here, so it highlights all of them. Type in 500, like so. Just make sure you've got number lock turned on, so you can use the numeric pad if you're typing it in that way. So here's my sphere. It's kind of outside the object. I then want to delete just some of the lower vertices. Now in wireframe, it's quite good. You can see the faces I want to delete. So if I just go into face mode, I right click on it, go face mode. I'm just going to, I've lined this up so that I can just drag a selection box like this around there. So I'm deleting nearly half of it, just a little bit under half of it. So that you can see it's selecting through the object. Just make sure they're all selected. Like that. You could do this in the side or the front view if you like, and then I just press the delete key, and that's deleted those faces. I press the 5 key again to go back to shaded, and we'll notice something here. If we look inside this object, it's black, okay, and the reverse faces of polygons render in black. Okay, it's still rendering this double-sided, but it's showing me that these are the front faces, the fact that they're kind of reacting to light and are being drawn grey, but the underside, like the bottom of the land, you can see that's been drawn in black, and also the bottom of this sphere. So what we want to do, we want to turn it inside out. And we're also going to turn off the double-sidedness so we can see through it and we can see our scene behind it. So go back to object mode, right click over it, go to object mode like this, and then go to mesh display and reverse it. There's a lot of things in mesh display to do with how faces display, so you can have a muck about with these. You can screw things up quite quickly, so be careful. You sometimes have to go back to set to face and then soften edges sometimes to set these up. So you can muck about with these. Like if I harden edges, you'll see the whole thing looks faceted. Look, if I turn off the wireframe, it all looks faceted. Okay, if I go to mesh display and I soften edges, it all looks smooth. It's added no more polygons, but it's just affecting the way it renders across edges. Okay, and then I'm going to go to mesh display and I'm going to reverse the whole thing. So I've turned it inside out, so look, it looks black now. I'll turn on my wireframe again here. I can just make out that it's grey on the inside, black on the outside. The next thing I want to do, I want to turn off the two-sidedness. So this is where we go into the attribute editor. So over here on the right hand side, here's the attribute editor. Relates to this icon here, so if it's not visible, click on this to highlight it in blue. And you can see now that we've got quite a few tabs here. Okay, this is because we've done a little bit of work to this sphere, and it's created this history. If I go back to the channel box, look, it's this history here. So we started with a polysphere, we deleted some components, We softened the edges. I was just demonstrating the mesh display, and then we turned the faces around. And this is all kind of history. So if we go to the attribute editor, all this history is here. We can delete that history and just get back to the sort of the core things we need to worry about. So I'm just going to go to this blue icon here, click on that, and look, it just goes back to the sphere node, the shape node, which is to do with kind of the components and the way it displays. This is more positional data. And then we've got the initial shading group that's assigned to it, and we'll be changing that in a bit. So in the shape node, I want to go down to render stats. And this is one of the most common tabs that you'll play about with in the attribute editor. There's a lot more stuff in here, but I hardly ever go near them. I generally, for individual objects, will go into the render stats and maybe the Arnold tab as well if I'm adjusting things for rendering. So go into here, and look, we've got a load of tick boxes relating to how this object renders. The one near the bottom is called double-sided. Turn that off and look, we can see through the object. It's now a single-sided object. We also, because this is a sky, we don't want it to cast or receive shadows. It's kind of a background object. Imagine if you had a low light in here and a character, it might cast a big kind of shadow onto the sky, which would look kind of weird. Okay, so we can turn off that as well, and that individual object will not cast or receive shadows. Okay, so that's good. We've got that set up. Next, we want to assign textures to it. So hopefully you've downloaded the Sky JPEG. So I'm going to click on this in object mode. So make sure it's green. If it's not in object mode, there you go, object mode by right clicking. I'm then going to hold the right mouse button down and assign a new material. I'm going to assign a Lambert. And this should come up in your attribute editor. Look, you can see it's actually gone to my render stats. I'll just close that down. Look, there's that Lambert too. So again, now that we've deleted that history and we've assigned a new material, we've only got 3 tabs appearing. And if we do any more manipulation to this object, add faces or delete stuff, it will build up those tabs, and you can delete them with this little blue icon here. Okay, there are times when we want to keep history, but that is really only when we start doing rigging and stuff like that, and we'll talk about that later on. I want to map the sky texture to the color, so I click on this icon here. I go in the render node, I click on File, I click on the little folder, and I go and find my sky. Double click on that, and that loads in the sky. We can't see it at the moment. If you press the 6 key, that should now become visible, but you can see it's a bit murky. By default, a Lambert will kind of get this kind of gradient kind of shadowing across it. So we want to eradicate that and make it almost like a flat shader. So if we just click off in the screen like that, this goes blank. Click on the object again, and we can go back to our material shader. We're going to map the same file to our incandescence, and this will brighten it up a bit. Okay, so I'll click on this. Exactly the same process. File, and then you can see it's gone white already, but we still want to load the file. And HN Sky again. Look, that looks a lot better. If we zoom in, look, we've got this sky. It's still not right though. The last thing we want to do is map the textures correctly. Okay, so I'm going to pick this, and I'm going to go to my UV editing workspace. Okay, if I click on this, give it a moment. This is the UV layout for the skydome. Okay, and you can see it's kind of it's got the triangles at the top here. You can see the thick lines of the border, the texture edges, sorry, and then it's kind of just spread around this area. So it's missing this nice sort of glow from the horizon, which I want. And if we turn on the checker grid, we can see how it starts off with, well, it's hard to see from that angle, but you can see the checker grid is quite small, and then it's spread out because look, all of these are fairly even. So it's not the best kind of layout, it's just the default layout. So look, I'll turn this off again. And all we're going to do, because this has no real texture detail in it, it's just a color gradient, we don't have to worry too much about how we lay this out. We're just going to do what's called a UV projection, just from either the X or the Z. Look, I'll show you the different kind of projections. If I go to Create, and look, we've got a planar, we've got cylindrical, stuff like that. If we go into planar options, so the little square box, we can project from X, Y, Z. Okay, so X we'll have a look at, looks like that. Z will look pretty much the same because it's just from the other angle. And Y is from the top, so we'll actually see we're looking down on it there. Okay, so we want it from either the X or the Z. Okay, keep this turned off. This will, if you have this turned on, it keeps the relative kind of shape of the polygons within the projection. This is filling this shape at the moment, it's stretching it to fit. you'll especially notice it from the side. Look, if I do it without that on, look, you can see it keeps this relative shape in the projection. If I turn it off, it stretches it, which is what we want. This means that look, at the bottom of the sphere now, we're getting that yellow hue, like the glow there. So we can close that window down. I'm happy with that. And we can go back to the classic view now. Okay, so we've got this kind of nearly ready. I'll go back to object mode. And the last thing we need to do, look, we've got some history on it, so let's clean it up. Let's delete that history. We've got this scale data on it. Okay, there's 500 scale. Let's freeze that, and it sets it back to 1. Okay, what's nice about resetting these things, it obviously avoids conflicts when you're parenting things. But if you accidentally, you drunk too much coffee and you do this, and you do this, and you move it over here somewhere, and you're like, I want to get it back to how it was. Look, you can just shift click on the transform and the rotates, type in 0, and then the same with the scale, but you type in 1, and it goes back to how it was. Okay, so it's quite a nice way of kind of locking a position on an object or a shape on an object by freezing its transforms. Okay, last thing we're going to do is put this on a display layer. So we pick that, new display layer, double click on it, call it sky, and save it and set it to R. Okay, now I want to zoom inside here, so I'm just going to pick on the signpost in my outliner, press F, and I zoom in on that signpost, which is quite nice. And look, we can have a look around. You can see if I go under the floor, I can see the back faces of the floor. So you could, if you want to, make the floor single-sided as well by going into the render stats in the shape node of the attribute editor. I kind of like it to be there because if I accidentally put the camera through the floor, I see it. The last thing we're going to do, I'm sure I've said this is the last thing we're going to do many, many times when we make the sky, but we are going to just create the camera for the scene. And I'll tell you a few little bits and pieces about the camera. So we've got our perspective camera, but this is our work camera. This is what we're going to be looking through when we're animating our characters and moving things about. Then we want the camera where we can actually animate and view and frame our objects with. So we're going to go to create cameras, and we're just going to create a basic camera, this one here. Okay, we've got some different cameras here that have constraints, so you can aim them to things and stuff like that, or attach them to things, but we're going to just create a basic camera like so. Now I'm in move mode, so you can see this manipulator tool has appeared, but I can't actually see my camera. It's quite small, so I'm going to press the R key, and if you click off and you lose your camera, look, it's here. It's the bottom, nearly the bottom item in your outliner. So pick it again, and look, we'll scale it up universally, and look, there it is. It looks like kind of an old 35mm, 16mm, whatever film camera. Okay, and so we've got this visible now, but we want to look through it. Okay, you can set up your views to look through it. You can look through it by going panels, perspective, and look, there's camera 1. Or you can do look through selected. You can do that with lights as well, which is quite good when you're positioning them. But in the perspective panel tab, you'll always find any cameras you add to the scene. Okay, so I tend to do this. I go to my 4 views over here, and I will sometimes set up one of these viewports to be my camera viewport. So let's say I'm going to use this one. There we go, there's camera 1. And then I can look through the camera. You can see it's updating here. Okay, so I can start to look through the camera. So I'll maximize this by tapping the space bar. So we're looking through the camera now. And I want to see what the camera would actually render. Now, because obviously we can change the shape of our viewport. So if I go back to our 4 views, I can do stuff like this. So I want to actually see what the camera's going to render. Let me just reset that. And through my camera view, look, you've got this little icon here with the blue dot. This is the resolution gate. And if I bring this up, it shows me exactly what the camera would render. And so look, we can see what it would see. And these are the ghost areas. You can turn this on and off if you want, and you just get the frame around it. But I think it's quite nice to ghost out the areas that you're not going to see. You can adjust this ratio. By default, this is 540 HD, so it's 960 pixels across by 540 high. If we go up to this little icon here, the clapperboard with the blue cog, this takes us into our render settings. And the only one we want to worry about at the moment is in the common tab. There's lots of options here, but in the common tab is image size down here. Okay, so the renderable camera, we might want to change that to camera 1 eventually when we're rendering stuff. But down here is our image size. So you might want to set it to 720p which is 1280 pixels by 720. I wouldn't go any bigger than that for what we're doing. Okay, the bigger you make it, the higher the resolution, the slower the render time. If you want to go Panavision on it, if you want to make it look more widescreen, because this is what we call 16:9, which is like your telly at home usually, we can put in a custom one. I think 536 is quite a good number, and this is more like Panavision movies, super widescreen, like your Star Wars and your big screen kind of pictures. Okay, and you can see the aspect ratio here is nearly 239. 239, 240 is like a common Panavision kind of widescreen. So we'll close that window down. And that is how we set up our camera. So that's hopefully shown you how to import all the objects, how to parent things, how to freeze transformations, how to delete history, how to use the outliner, how to use the attribute editor a little bit, and your channel box, how to create cameras. You can select cameras using this, like so. You can also select cameras. If you haven't got your outliner there, you can go View and select camera. So whichever camera you're looking for, you can do that. You can see this resolution gate highlights in white to mean that it's actually selected. And you can animate cameras pretty much like you can animate an object. You can just move your time slider to where you want it to be, make sure it's selected, press S, move your time slider, move to another position. So let's give you a demo. I'll press S, that's keyed the camera. I can move to another position then. Say like I zoom it in on this to here, press S again, and then we'll see that our camera is animated now. Okay, so that's the absolute basics, and we'll continue this in class next week. Okay.